The morning sun slipped through the blinds just as I stepped into the kitchen, still wearing my flannel work shirt from a late-night project. My wife sat at the table, calm as ever, sipping coffee in her business-casual blouse. Her dark hair was tied neatly in a bun. There was a white envelope between us, the HOA logo stamped in red. Not a bill. A threat. I tore it open with my calloused fingers, expecting the usual petty nonsense. But the second I read the number, my breath hitched. $3,500. For failure to remove unauthorized lawn decor. The decor. A single wooden planter I'd built myself. Custom. Perfect. Legal. Ignore it, my wife said, completely unfazed. She was always like that, steady, unreadable, even when fire burned around her. I wasn't as calm. They've lost their damn minds. She didn't reply. She didn't need to. She already knew what I'd do next. March down to the HOA office and demand answers. But before I could even reach the door, she added the one sentence that froze me. I'll handle it if they escalate. Her tone was sharp, precise, the voice she used in courtrooms. Not everyone knew she was a judge, but they were about to. 3 hours later, Karen, the HOA's self-appointed queen, stood on our lawn, arms crossed, sunglasses low, recording everything with her phone. She had the nerve to smile when she saw us. "Since you're ignoring the fine," she said loudly, making sure the neighbors heard, "I've notified authorities. Maybe you'll listen to the police." My wife raised an eyebrow but said nothing. She wasn't here to argue with a woman who lived for drama. I stepped forward, fists clenched. "You called the cops for a planter box?" Karen smirked. "No. For intimidation and non-compliance. And they'll be here any minute." And right on cue, the cruiser pulled up. Lights on. Sirens off. Karen strutted aside like she owned the street. The officer, a tall man in his early 40s, stepped out with a clipboard. "We received a complaint," he began, but then his eyes moved past me. Landed on my wife. Froze. Completely. His face drained of color. The clipboard slipped an inch. "Ma'am. Judge." Karen's expression cracked. "Judge," she echoed, confused but suddenly uneasy. My wife stood calmly with her coffee, as if she expected this exact moment. The officer straightened so fast he almost tripped. "I didn't realize you lived here." Karen blinked rapidly. "Why, you know her." The officer cleared his throat and looked at my wife with unmistakable respect. "Ma'am, should I proceed?" My wife stepped forward, cool determination in her eyes. "Yes, officer. I'll be filing a complaint regarding harassment and abuse of process." Karen's jaw dropped. "Harassment? You can't." But she stopped when the officer turned toward her with the expression of a man who realized he'd been dragged into a political landmine. Karen wanted a war. She just didn't know she picked a fight with someone who wins them for a living. The street felt suddenly colder, like the air itself knew Karen had crossed a line she couldn't step back from. The officer shifted his stance, clearly uncomfortable, trying to make sense of how he'd been dragged into a petty HOA meltdown, one that now involved a sitting judge. My wife didn't raise her voice or even change her expression. That was what made it terrifying. She simply nodded toward Karen. "Officer, please ask her to repeat the complaint she filed." Karen stiffened. I don't have to repeat anything. The complaint is official." Her voice wavered. She clutched her phone like a lifeline. "They refused to pay a fine. That's all." My wife took one measured step forward. "You filed a police complaint for non-payment of an HOA fine? That is not a criminal issue. That is a civil matter. You knowingly misused police resources." She looked at the officer. "That's harassment. And a false report." The officer swallowed hard. This was no longer a neighbor dispute. This was paperwork, internal scrutiny, and potential disciplinary review. Exactly what cops hate walking into. Karen tried to recover. "I didn't lie. I told him. He's been intimidating me." The officer looked at me, at my beard, my solid builder's frame, my flannel shirt. I definitely looked like someone Karen could lie about. But my wife calmly folded her arms. "Intimidation. Officer, did she tell you she was recording us?" approaching our property, threatening fines she has no authority to issue without board vote. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish. I am the HOA vice president, she blurted. My wife didn't blink. And that gives you less authority than you think. The officer exhaled through his nose and finally turned to Karen. Ma'am, do you have documentation of the violation? Or proof of intimidation? She froze. That was the moment her entire plan deflated. Slowly, reluctantly, she opened her HOA folder. But instead of providing clarity, it only stirred deeper confusion. The officer's brows knitted. These aren't standard violation forms. They're handwritten? He held up one page where $3,500 was written in thick marker, slanted, uneven. Karen snatched the papers back. The president approved it. My wife tilted her head. Did he? Or did you? Her voice sharpened. Officer, may I see your report? He handed it over instantly. She scanned it, and then her eyes narrowed. You were told this was an emergency? The officer nodded reluctantly. Dispatch said, active threat. That hit like a bomb. Neighbors watching from porches leaned forward. Karen's face drained white. My wife's tone dropped to freezing levels. You claimed there was an active threat on our property? Over a planter box. Karen stumbled back. And no, I didn't use those exact words. But she had. Dispatch doesn't invent codes. Someone exaggerated. Someone lied to escalate. The officer looked trapped between duty and embarrassment. Ma'am, he addressed Karen firmly now, false emergency calls can be prosecuted. And wasting police resources is a serious offense. Karen trembled visibly. I didn't mean, I just wanted them to listen. They were ignoring the HOA fine. My wife stepped closer. Karen, you weaponized the police because you couldn't bully your way into control. That ends today. She turned to the officer. I'll need the incident log and the CAD notes from dispatch. And I'll be subpoenaing the HOA's internal correspondence. Karen gasped. Subpoena? You can't do that. My wife simply met her eyes. I can. And I will. At that moment, the officer's radio crackled. A dispatcher asked for an update. The officer paused, then glanced at my wife with clear deference. Tell them I'll handle it, he said quietly into the radio. He wasn't talking as a cop anymore. He was talking like someone who realized he had accidentally stepped into a political hurricane, and the safest place to stand was on our side. Karen wasn't facing a fine anymore. She was facing consequences. The neighborhood looked different now. Not physically, nothing had changed, but the energy had. Word spread fast when a cop freezes at the sight of your wife because she's a judge. By the time we walked back toward the house, phones were out. Curtains twitched. Karen, red-faced and trembling, paced near the sidewalk like she was rehearsing excuses for an audience that had already stopped listening. The officer wasn't done. Judge, with your permission, he said, I'd like to look at the HOA's complaint history. Something's not adding up. Karen spun around so fast her sunglasses nearly flew off. You can't just, that's private HOA business. The officer raised an eyebrow. Private? Not when you involve emergency services. My wife nodded calmly. Go ahead, officer. I'd like to see for myself. Karen's composure shattered. She whipped out her phone and began tapping furiously. I'm getting the board here. All of them. Now. Her voice cracked with panic. She didn't call them for backup, she called them for survival. 15 minutes later, 3 board members arrived, each looking more nervous than the last. They approached cautiously, like they already knew this wasn't going to go Karen's way. One of them, a middle-aged man with glasses, rubbed his forehead. Karen, what did you do? Before she could answer, the officer cut in. I need full access to violation records, fine approvals, internal emails, and any documentation justifying the $3,500 penalty. The board exchanged glances, long, guilty ones. The man with glasses sighed deeply. We don't have those records. My wife's expression sharpened. Excuse me. Another board member, a woman clutching a binder, spoke in a small voice. Karen handles the fines. She said she was authorized. Karen's head snapped toward her. I am authorized. I'm the vice president. I can issue fines. My wife shook her head. Not without a documented vote. Not without procedure. The officer frowned. So you've been issuing fines alone? A silence fell so heavy even the breeze seemed to stop. Finally, the board member with glasses exhaled. She's been pushing fines without approval for months. Gasps erupted from the neighbors watching. Karen's face turned an alarming shade of white. You told me to, she hissed. You all said the community needed strict enforcement. The woman with the binder stepped back. We never told you to falsify violations. The officer's radio buzzed, but he ignored it. He was invested now. Judge, he said carefully, it appears there's a pattern of fraudulent fines. Possibly extortion. Karen shook her head violently. No. No. This is all being blown out of proportion. My wife opened her handbag, pulled out a notepad, and began writing with slow, deliberate strokes, legal strokes. Officer, I will be filing formal complaints, subpoenas, and civil claims. I want the HOA's financial records, private communications, and bank statements reviewed. Karen took a shaky step backward. Bank statements. You can't pry into. Extortion is a crime. My wife said it calmly, like stating the weather. And it hit harder than any scream could. The board members immediately crumbled. The woman with the binder spoke first. Karen, you told us the money was going toward landscaping contracts. The officer's eyebrow lifted. Landscaping. According to neighbors I interviewed last month, you haven't hired a landscaping crew in almost a year. That was the breaking point. Karen shook, her voice barely a whisper. I didn't keep it. I reinvested it. She stopped, because she finally realized what she just admitted. The officer's face went cold. My wife closed her notepad. The board stepped away from her like she was radioactive. Karen wasn't fighting for authority anymore. She was fighting for freedom. And losing. The sun was dipping behind the rooftops when the neighborhood gathered on the cul-de-sac, drawn by the storm that had been brewing all day. The HOA board stood in a shaky line beside Karen, who paced back and forth like a cornered animal. My wife, calm as ever in her business casual attire, stood at the center of the crowd, holding a slim folder that looked far more dangerous than any weapon. Every neighbor watched her with quiet anticipation. They weren't afraid of her. They were waiting for justice. Karen suddenly raised her phone triumphantly. Fine. If you want a war, you'll get one, she screamed as she hit dial. I'm calling my attorney. He said he'd handle any accusations. My wife didn't even turn her head. She simply whispered to me, let's see how deep this goes. The call connected, and Karen immediately launched into hysterics. They're plotting against me. They're making up lies. I need you here, now. On speaker, the attorney sighed. Loudly. Karen, I warned you about unauthorized fines. Gasps rippled across the crowd. My wife raised an eyebrow. Unauthorized, she echoed calmly. So you knew the fines didn't follow procedure? The attorney froze. Judge. Is that you? He stammered. Before he could save himself, another voice cut through the tension, this one behind us. A police cruiser approached. Same officer. Different energy. He stepped out holding a stack of printed documents, clipped neatly together. His expression was no longer uncertain. It was resolute. Judge, he said, offering her the folder, I have the dispatch call logs, HOA financial summaries, and a report from our fraud unit. We found discrepancies. Karen staggered backward. No, this isn't happening. But it was happening. And everyone knew it. My wife took the folder, scanning pages with silent precision. Multiple fines issued without board approval, she read aloud. Funds deposited into a personal account. Emergency calls made under false pretenses. And attempted intimidation of homeowners. She snapped the folder shut. Officer, this is enough to proceed. Karen broke. No. This isn't fair. I was trying to keep the neighborhood in order. I did everything for the community. She pointed at the board, voice cracking. You told me to enforce the rules. You told me to go hard. The board members stepped back like she was contagious. We never told you to steal the money, one whispered. Another added, you said the funds were for seasonal upgrades. We thought the fines were approved, the last muttered. Neighbors erupted into angry chatter. My wife raised a hand, and silence fell instantly. She turned to the board. This HOA is legally required to hold a public emergency meeting. She pointed at Karen. Given the evidence, she cannot preside. She will sit down. Karen shook her head violently, but the officer stepped forward. Ma'am, take a seat. Karen sunk onto the curb, shaking uncontrollably. My wife positioned herself in front of the crowd. We are here to determine whether the current HOA leadership has acted in good faith. Her voice carried authority that silenced even the wind. Financial mismanagement. False reporting. Abuse of power. Extortion. Each word landed like a hammer strike. The community spoke for the first time, voices strong. She fined me $900 for bird feeders, twice. She threatened to report my kid for chalk drawings. She banned holiday lights, then put up her own. She trespassed into my backyard. The board crumbled under the wave of testimonies. My wife nodded. Motion to remove the sitting vice president. Hands shot up everywhere, dozens of them. Unanimous. Karen let out a strangled sob. Then my wife continued, motion to dissolve the current board pending forensic audit. More hands. Even the board members raised theirs. The officer approached Karen. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with me to answer some questions downtown. She tried to stand, but her knees buckled. This isn't how it was supposed to go. My wife closed her folder with quiet finality. It's exactly how it was supposed to go. Morning light washed across the neighborhood like a fresh coat of paint, softer than it had felt in months. For the first time in a long time, people walked their dogs without glancing nervously toward the HOA office. Kids rode their bikes freely, chalk drawings decorated sidewalks, and neighbors chatted openly in driveways. No fear, no threats, no Karen lurking with a clipboard. The air carried a quiet relief, the kind that only arrives after a storm has torn everything apart and left space for something better to grow. I sat on our porch steps, coffee cup warming my hands, still wearing my flannel work shirt from yesterday. It felt like the uniform of someone who had fought a war he didn't start but was damn sure he was going to finish. My wife stepped outside, immaculate as always, her dark hair in that same precise bun. But something softer lived in her expression now, quiet satisfaction. The officer called, she said, sitting beside me. They've opened a full investigation. Forensic audits, interviews, the works. It's going to clean every corner. Her voice wasn't triumphant. It was resolute. The voice of someone who didn't celebrate victories. She ensured justice. Across the street, the former HOA board members gathered silently, handing over boxes of records to a city official. For once, they looked like regular neighbors, not self-appointed rulers. One approached us cautiously. Judge, thank you, he murmured. We let things get out of control. We should have stopped her sooner. My wife nodded. You have a chance now to rebuild this community the right way. Her tone was firm but not condemning. No more arbitrary fines. No more power games. Real transparency. You owe your neighbors that. The man swallowed hard, nodding again before returning to the others. Watching them step down didn't feel like vengeance. It felt like balance being restored. Then Karen appeared. She wasn't in handcuffs. Not yet. She stood beside the officer, her posture broken, as if the weight of her choices had finally settled on her shoulders. The officer gave us a respectful nod. She wanted to say something, he said. Karen's eyes were red, her voice barely holding together. I'm sorry, she whispered. I thought I was helping the neighborhood. I didn't realize how far I'd pushed things. Her voice cracked. I was wrong. My wife studied her for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she spoke quietly. Being wrong isn't the crime, Karen. Refusing to stop, that's what destroyed you. Karen lowered her head, tears falling to the pavement. The officer guided her away gently. She wasn't a villain anymore. Just a person facing the consequences she spent years avoiding. A warm breeze swept across the street. For the first time in forever, it felt peaceful. By sunset, the community had gathered for an informal meeting on the lawn. No podiums, no power plays, no threats. Just neighbors rebuilding what had been broken. My wife outlined a temporary oversight committee, explained legal safeguards, and helped them nominate new volunteers. People stepped up. People listened. People cared. As the meeting wrapped up, a little girl ran past us with sidewalk chalk, drawing bright stars on the concrete. Her mother, relieved, didn't rush to stop her. My wife smiled, the small kind of smile she rarely showed except when she knew justice had made real change. I put an arm around her shoulders. You know, I said, most people don't have a judge on their side. She glanced at me, smirking. Most people don't have a husband who builds planters that cause uprisings. We laughed, for the first time in days. The storm was over. The neighborhood was ours again. And this time it would be fair.